It was 5 October 1944 when the Halsey Powell was moored in the anchorage of the Navy's brand new operating base in the Ulithi Atoll. DD-686 and the rest of DesRon 53 had just arrived the previous day after being deployed continuously for the last 4 months. She participated in the invasion of Saipan, the invasion of Tinian, supported ground forces fighting on Guam, Screen Task Force 38.2 during air attacks on the island of Palau, and Japanese positions in the Philippines. When they dropped anchor the day before, it had been 128 days since they had left Pearl Harbor, and the crew was looking forward to some downtime. The Navy had just opened a brand new R&R facility in Ulithi, and the crew could hardly wait to get off the ship and check it out. But the word was the fleet would be heading out again soon. In fact, the crew of DD-686 would have exactly 1 day to check out the new recreational facilities on the island of Mogmog. Friday morning, 6 October 1944, Halsey Powell's skipper, Commander McGarry, was moving to a new command. At 08:15, Commander Sidney Merrill came aboard and assumed command of the ship. New orders were already waiting for the new commander. DesRon 53 was moving out immediately to Screen Task Force 38.2, which was beginning to assemble outside the lagoon. The group formed around the 3 Essex-class carriers, USS Hancock, the Intrepid, and the Bunker Hill. At 17:30 that afternoon, the battleship New Jersey rang up an ahead standard bell and turned northwest. All the ships in the group turned in unison, matching the guide's course and speed. By Tuesday, 10 October, the task force was operating southeast of the Japanese island of Okinawa, which the Americans fully expected the enemy to vehemently defend. It was, after all, one of the Japanese homeland islands. At daybreak, the weather was good. The carriers began launching aircraft. First up were CAP, or Combat Air Patrol. CAP aircraft orbited high above the fleet, forming a sort of protective umbrella, ready to pounce on enemy air threats. Next up were anti-snooping and reconnaissance patrols. Finally, the fighters and bombers that would attack targets on Okinawa. While the carriers cycled through periods of launching and retrieving aircraft throughout the day, the destroyers screened for submarines and air threats, and also performed plane guard duty. That is, retrieving the occasional aircrew that ended up in the sea. When time permitted, they also conducted housekeeping duties, like moving mail, personnel, and supplies between ships. At 15:24, General Quarters was sounded as a single enemy aircraft approached. CAP aircraft were vectored to intercept, and soon a burning Japanese aircraft arced from the sky and crashed into the sea. After dark that evening, Halsey Powell again went to General Quarters when radar observed another enemy aircraft approaching the group at 23:45. It was likely a reconnaissance aircraft looking for the fleet in the darkness. Radar watched as the aircraft passed nearby without altering course, apparently not seeing the group. Overnight into 11 October, the formation moved south, rendezvoused with Task Unit 30.8.1, a fueling unit, and filled their tanks approximately 300 miles east of the island of Formosa. While the ships met up with the tankers, Halsey Powell stayed with the carrier USS Intrepid, who remained busy launching and retrieving CAP and ASP, or anti-snooping patrols, that protected the group while they refueled throughout the day. When it was Halsey Powell's turn, She matched speed with the USS Mississinawa and topped off. Overnight into Thursday, 12 October, the group moved toward Formosa. When the sun came up, the carriers began launching airstrikes against targets in the Karun area. At 0627, lookouts spotted an aircraft crashing into the sea. Halsey Powell proceeded to investigate, unsure if it was friendly or not. Arriving on the scene, not a thing was found on the surface. Whoever they were gone. The day was spent in routine screening duties until 1855, when the task group went to general quarters. Enemy aircraft were approaching. Cap was vectored to intercept and shot down several. The rest would be up to the gunnery crews. As anti-aircraft batteries gained firing solutions, they opened fire, filling the sky with tracers and exploding anti-aircraft rounds. The attackers seemed to have lost their enthusiasm and retreated, 3 trailing smoke and flames. At 23:30, the task group was illuminated by enemy flares. Not long after, 2 torpedo wakes were reported, but no ships in Task Force 38.2 had been struck. When the clock struck midnight, it was Friday, the 13th. In 01:52, enemy aircraft returned and attacked. Ships opened fire, and anti-aircraft tracers filled the sky. After 20 minutes of harassing the fleet, the Japanese aircraft left the area. Task Group 38.2 remained damage-free. The remainder of the night was quiet. At 09:25 on the morning of Friday the 13th, Halsey Powell got a report of a man in the water and immediately headed to the location. Searching the area for 30 minutes revealed nothing. Perhaps he had already been picked up, or he was gone. Weather conditions had become poor. Admiral Mitcher ordered the cancellation of all air ops after 1400 and to prepare for the Japanese night attacks. That evening, Task Groups 38.1 and 38.4 took the brunt of the Japanese onslaught. At 1845 that evening, the crew of the Halsey Powell heard an explosion that came from where Task Group 38.1 was operating. It was the USS Canberra, a Baltimore-class cruiser. She had been struck by an airdropped Japanese torpedo. Anti-aircraft batteries exploded into action at 1909 as low-flying enemy planes made attacks against various ships in the group. Tracers streaked across the water, sending geysers skyward when they impacted the water. By 2025, the enemy attacks were over, and the Halsey Powell secured from general quarters. On Saturday, 14 October, the task group resumed air attacks against targets on Formosa. Japanese aircraft attacked the fleet throughout the morning. Cap aircraft shot down and chased off the attackers before ships had a chance to open fire. That afternoon, radar periodically painted enemy aircraft, but most stayed more than 10 miles distant. At 1511, a lone aircraft approached the Halsey Powell's starboard bow. The ship's AA batteries opened fire. The plane was struck, caught fire, and crash-landed into the water. This was the first aircraft the Halsey Powell had officially shot down. The only problem was it was an American SB-2C Helldiver. The gunners went from glee to feeling terrible. Very fortunate for the airplane's crew, they were unhurt and pulled from the sea by the USS Oakland. At 17:10, the general quarters klaxon was again sounding. Radar had picked up a large formation of enemy aircraft heading toward the task group, range 40 miles. Cap was vectored to intercept and shot down 23. The remainder turned and fled. Japanese aircraft continued to threaten for another 2 hours before subsiding. The group moved east, spending 15 October alongside tankers drinking their share of fuel oil. The aircraft carriers kept the group protected by keeping anti-snooping patrols and CAP aloft throughout the day. The few Japanese aircraft that did threaten were either shot down or driven off. Into 16 October, the group moved back toward Formosa. When the sun came up, the carriers launched CAP and ASP aircraft, but no fighter or bomber ops were planned that day. At 10:16, the general quarters klaxon sounded when a group of enemy aircraft appeared on radar. The crew scrambled to battle stations. 7 Japanese aircraft made runs on the task group. One dropped a torpedo meant for the carrier Intrepid, but with quick evasive action, the torpedo missed. Any vessel that gained a firing solution was shooting and filling the airspace over the group with projectiles and shrapnel. 45 minutes later, the enemy threat was over. That afternoon, DD-686 heard reports that the carrier recon patrols had sighted a group of enemy ships to the northeast. The report said that the pilots had seen carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. To the crew, that sure sounded like a Japanese task force. In fact, what the pilots had spotted was a diversionary force the Japanese wanted Admiral Halsey to chase, to move the task force north and away from the central Philippines. If successful, they hoped that this would allow them to attack and crush the American landings on Leyte. October, Task Force 38.2 spent fueling and passing mail and supplies between ships. It then moved toward the Philippine island of Luzon. On Wednesday, 18 October 1944, the carriers began air operations at dawn, striking positions near Apari and Loag on Luzon. The 19th was spent refueling. Overnight into 20 October, Task Group 38.2 was back on station east of Luzon, guarding the right flank of the invasion force against Japanese forces. The only air ops that day were CAP and ASP aircraft sent out to protect the group while it operated east of the island. Further south at 1000, U.S. forces under General Douglas MacArthur commenced landings on the Philippine island of Leyte. Task Group 38.2 eased further south until it was operating east of the central Philippines. On 21 October, the carriers were again launching attacks, striking positions on Panay, Cebu, Negros, and Masbate. By 24 October, the task group was 50 miles east of the San Bernardino Strait. The carriers launched their usual reconnaissance aircraft at dawn. However, at 08:20 this morning, one radioed in, seeing 2 Japanese naval groups sailing eastward just south of the Philippine island of Mindoro. The pilots reported seeing battleships, cruisers, and several destroyers. The Americans did not yet know they had just stumbled upon what became known as the Japanese Central Force that was intent on destroying the American landings on Leyte. At 09:38, General Quarters was sounded. Enemy airplanes had been spotted on radar. Japanese torpedo planes made runs on the task group, which immediately initiated torpedo evasion maneuvers. Heavy anti-aircraft fire drove off a torpedo plane making a run on the Intrepid, and the destroyer Cushing shot down a second. The remaining aircraft were either shot down or turned and retreated, with little damage inflicted on the task group. As soon as the attack was over, the carriers wasted no time launching aircraft against the Japanese force that was spotted that morning. Torpedo planes, dive bombers, and fighters attacked and harassed the Japanese fleet for much of the day. One vessel was sunk and several others damaged. By nightfall, the Japanese fleet had turned around and were now retreating westward. When the clock struck midnight on 25 October 1944, it was Wednesday. It was also the one-year anniversary of the Halsey Powell's commissioning. To the crew, it must have seemed like a lifetime ago. Now there was a Japanese naval force to the north, another to the south, and Japanese air bases to the west. Few of the crew likely gave the anniversary much thought. The day would also bring another first for the Americans in World War II. Japan formally began using one of their most terrifying weapons of the war. Squadrons of young Japanese pilots who had been specially trained would be unleashed this day. Their sole mission? To crash their bomb and fuel-laden aircraft into the center of any American aircraft carrier they could find. The Kamikaze, or in Japanese, the Divine Wind, was the storm the Japanese hoped would save their empire against the ever-approaching Americans. Further south, just after sunrise, the Japanese force that was retreating westward yesterday was emerging on the east side of the San Bernardino Strait. Unknown to the Americans, overnight the Japanese force had again turned around, steamed eastward all night, still intent on attacking the Leyte landings. One of the most heroic and lopsided naval battles in history was about to unfold. As the Japanese fleet emerged from the San Bernardino Strait, they ran right into a small element of the American fleet called Task Unit 77.4, also known as Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was composed of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts. They were facing a Japanese force made up of 4 battleships, the Yamato, Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, plus 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. The battleship Yamato all by herself weighed in at more than all of the ships of Taffy 3 combined. Both the Americans and the Japanese were completely surprised as they sailed into view of each other. The American destroyers from Taffy 3 mounted a ferocious attack against the larger, well-armored Japanese battleships and cruisers. The destroyers USS Johnson, Samuel B. Roberts, Hull, and Heermann rang up ahead flank bells, turned toward the huge ships of the Japanese fleet, opened up with their 5-inch guns, raking the huge targets ahead. When within range, they launched their full complement of torpedoes, one of which blew the bow completely off a Japanese cruiser. The Japanese force was also attacked from the air by American aircraft. The sheer ferocity of the attack made the Japanese commander believe he had run headlong into the American fleet. Admiral Kurita ordered the Japanese group to about face and retreat. And this time, they would not return. And with that, the Japanese threat to the Leyte landings evaporated into thin air. But the victory didn't come without a heavy price. The big guns of the Japanese force took a heavy toll on Taffy 3. 2 escort carriers were sunk, as were 3 destroyers. Several air crews were lost. Over 1,000 American sailors and officers had died in the battle. But the Japanese Navy and their largest battleship, the Yamato, had turned, retreated, and would never again pose a threat to the American forces in the Pacific. While Taffy 3 was fighting it out with the Japanese off Samar, Admiral Halsey had taken the bait. DD-686 and the rest of Fast Carrier Task Group 38.2 were chasing down the northern Japanese carrier force, drawing Admiral Halsey away from Leyte just as the Japanese had hoped. By noon, Admiral Halsey figured out he had been duped. He issued orders to move south and attack the Japanese force that had emerged near the San Bernardino Strait. Task Force 38.2 made best speed south toward the strait. They did not yet know that the heroic acts of Taffy 3 had already turned back the Japanese fleet. By 26 October, Task Force 38 had moved back south and was operating 100 miles northeast of the island of Samar. The carriers of Task Group 38.2 launched air attacks against the now retreating Japanese Central Force. They exacted their revenge by sinking another ship and badly damaging several others of the fleeing Japanese fleet. By 29 October, the task group was east of Luzon. While the carriers were busy attacking enemy positions around Manila Bay, the destroyers screened and performed plane guard duty. At 11:45, an airplane made a water landing 1,000 yards dead ahead of Halsey Powell. Ensign F.W. Troop from the USS Cabot was fished out of the sea. The airman was no sooner brought aboard when general quarters rang out. Enemy aircraft could be seen on radar. Halsey Powell opened up as soon as the crews got firing solutions, as did others in the group, filling the sky with tracers and black clouds of flak. Despite their efforts, at 12:04, a Japanese kamikaze impacted the USS Intrepid on her port side. The crash site erupted in flames, but the fire was quickly extinguished. Structural damage to the ship was minor, but 10 crew members had lost their lives. Enemy aircraft had cleared the area by 1300. Just before 1700, the klaxon again rang out as another wave of Japanese aircraft attacked. Ships opened fire. 15 minutes after the attack began, the Japanese aircraft were either shot out of the air or retreating low across the waves. At 1858, an aircraft crashed into the sea, bearing 110 degrees, distance 2,500 yards. The Halsey Powell recovered a soaking wet Lieutenant Junior Grade D.W. Baker and his radio man, P.D. Fowler, both happy to be aboard. After darkness, lookouts heard a whistle in the water and later saw red flares. Searches of the area produced nothing. Overnight into Monday, 30 October, lookouts spotted a light at 0200, around 7,000 yards distant. That search proved more fruitful. 3 groups of airmen were recovered. Most had come from the Intrepid's Torpedo Squadron 10. After sunrise, DD-686 transferred 21 airmen to the USS Intrepid and 1 to the Cabot. For their efforts, the carrier sent over ice cream, their unofficial way of saying thank you for returning their pilots. On the last day of October, the group moved south to support the Leyte invasion operation. They used the time to refuel at sea and to move mail and supplies between ships. At 1300 on 3 November, orders came to move the task group east of Luzon. At dawn on Sunday, 5 November, air ops began. While strikes were being made on positions around Clark Field near Manila, arrangements were being made to move Lieutenant L.D. Moore over to the USS Colohan. So that afternoon, Lieutenant Moore got to ride the rocking, bobbing, and rolling breeches buoy that seemed to suspend him mere inches above the roiling water. He looked up at what he thought was a thin, wispy-looking cable that stretched and swayed as he was hauled between the 2 vessels. It was over in less than a minute, and even his feet were dry. Air alerts came several times overnight, but no aircraft threatened in the area of Halsey Powell. The group continued airstrikes against Clark Field the following day, finally retiring late on 6 November, turning toward Ulithi. They entered the atoll 2 days later. Since leaving Pearl Harbor back on 30 May, it had been 162 days of duty with only 1 day of liberty. Maybe now they would have some time to see what the new R&R island of Mogmog on Ulithi was all about. November 1944 found the Halsey Powell and the rest of Task Group 38.2 anchored in the lagoon of the Ulithi Atoll. The task group resupplied, and the sailors finally got time ashore on Ulithi's little island of Mogmog. This isolated atoll had recently been chosen as the U.S. Navy's primary base in the Western Pacific and was growing bigger and more capable every day. The Navy did its best to turn this tropical island into a sort of home away from home for their sailors. And after spending long periods at sea, facing enemy attacks almost daily, liberty and time ashore was greatly appreciated. The sailors and officers made good use of the facilities on Mogmog. However, the war raged on further out in the Pacific, and the task group was needed. 5 days of liberty was deemed enough. It was time to get back to work. On Tuesday, 14 November, the destroyers of DesRon 53 formed into an anti-submarine screen as the heavies from Task Group 38.2 assembled outside the atoll. The USS New Jersey was chosen as the group's guide. Late in the afternoon, New Jersey rang up and a head standard bell, took up a heading of 270 degrees, and the entire task group followed in unison. Destination: the Philippine Islands. During the voyage, training was conducted. The carriers launched aircraft that would fly out and conduct simulated attacks on the formation. Ships repelled these attacks with mock anti-aircraft drills. During darkness, night fighters were launched and practiced and refined their interception skills. By Thursday, 16 November, the group was several hundred miles east of the Philippine Islands. Before moving any closer, they rendezvoused with a group of tankers and topped off their fuel bunkers in preparation for days of running at high speed. The next day, Friday, 17 November, Task Group 38.2 joined with Task Groups 38.1 and 38.4, forming a huge armada of 83 warships that would attack Japanese strongholds in the Philippines. In the hours before sunrise on Sunday, 19 November 1944, Halsey Powell and the destroyer USS Hunt were screening the USS Independence while she engaged in night fighter operations. Her fighters were vectored to intercept enemy aircraft that had been harassing the group during the night. Their efforts paid off at 0200 when a Japanese flying boat went down in flames. After sunrise, DD-686 returned to her regular screening duties. The carriers launched strikes against positions on Luzon. Throughout the day, groups of Japanese aircraft periodically approached. None made it past the task force's cap aircraft that continually operated overhead. As soon as enemy aircraft were picked up on radar, cap was vectored to intercept. All were attacked and many shot down. Japanese pilots, seeing so many of their fellow airmen shot out of the sky, turned and fled the area. That night, Halsey Powell and the USS Hunt once again accompanied the carrier Independence as she conducted night fighter operations. On 20 November, Halsey Powell, along with sister destroyers Allman, Cushing, and the Benham, were transferred to Task Group 38.4. By 1100, the 4 destroyers had repositioned and were patrolling with their new group. The assignment was a bit of a blessing because the next day, Tuesday, 21 November, the group was proceeding to Ulithi. The group swung by the small island of Yap along the way, arriving in the early morning darkness of 22 November. Yap was just 85 nautical miles southwest of Ulithi and was another isolated Japanese outpost. The Japanese there posed little threat as long as they remained cut off. However, the small garrison did what they could to harass the Americans operating in the area. So the Americans periodically bombed and shelled the island. This was one such opportunity. At daybreak, the carriers launched strikes on Japanese positions, dropping bombs and napalm on the enemy. By 1100, the raid was over and the group proceeded to Ulithi, entering the atoll 3 hours later. The next day was Thursday, 23 November. It was Thanksgiving Day, 1944. The crew of the Halsey Powell spent the holiday in the tropical waters of the lagoon of Ulithi Atoll, far away from their homes and families. That afternoon, the cooks made the crew a nice turkey dinner with all of the trimmings. On Saturday, 25 November, DD-686 was moved into ARD-13, an auxiliary repair dock or floating dry dock. By 1600, she was sitting atop keel blocks, high and dry. Workers began repairs to the sonar dome and bilge keels. Since the ship was out of the water, the crew was ordered over the side to scrape and paint the hull.